If I could ask everyone to please take a seat.
That's why I said to you.
I'm happy this afternoon to be able to provide a policy perspective to balance the science perspective that we had during the first part of this afternoon's session. And I'm very happy to be able to present to you two folks who work in that arena, Adam Diamant and Ruben Lubowski, who will be talking this afternoon about the policy side of agricultural mitigation. And Adam will talk first about the corporate market for carbon credits. Adam is a program officer for EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. He's an economist by training, and so has that perspective. He runs the Global Climate Change Program at EPRI and has a great deal of experience in a variety of climate-related issues, including the development of international greenhouse gas emissions trading, corporate greenhouse gas risk analysis and risk management, and other aspects of greenhouse gas and climate change issues that matter to the corporate sector. And Adam, prior to joining EPRI, Adam worked for Office of Management and Budget in Washington, and today he's going to talk about the corporate market. Adam?
Thanks, Phil. Let's see if I can. You guys set that up. Sorry. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm with the Electric Power Research Institute. Phil gave me a promotion. I'm not the director of our climate program. That would be a fellow named Richard Richels, who's a lead author at the IPCC and has been for many, many years. But I'm one of the senior program people in the program. My particular expertise is offsets. And I'm really delighted to be here because we're actually funders of the nitrous oxide work that you saw presented by several of the previous speakers. I found Phil in Baltimore about 4 or 5 years ago, and we hatched this idea of looking at nitrous oxide emission reductions in agricultural production through the reduction of fertilizer use as a potentially very cost-effective and large-scale option, and I'm really excited that that work has proven out scientifically. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. I'm not going to talk so much about the corporate market for carbon credits. What I am going to talk about is the key role of greenhouse gas emission offsets in evolving U.S. climate policy. And that will definitely touch on the evolving market of carbon for the corporate sector. Just so you know who EPRI is, there's a lot of confusion about us. We're a nonprofit 501c3 research and technology organization, offices in Palo Alto, California, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Knoxville, Tennessee, and a number of satellites around the country. Our work's really in 5 areas: generation of electric power, including renewables, environment, all environment issues associated with electric power generation, dispatch, transmission, distribution, etc., power delivery, market design, energy efficiency, nuclear power, and a whole program on innovation that's actually broader than just in the electric sector. Basically, every power company in the country is a member of some program at EPRI. And that's just not the investor-owned utilities, that's municipal utilities, public power, the federal power marketing agencies, merchant power generators. Pretty much everybody in the power business is a member of some of our programs. Not all of them are members of the climate program, for sure. And then internationally, we have members in many, many countries abroad. So what I'd like to talk about today is really the challenge of greenhouse gas emission reductions overall, nationally, benefits and risks of greenhouse gas offsets in particular, and offsets as they're thought about in the current legislation that's passed the House, the so-called Waxman-Markey bill. Now, let's be clear. So this is business as usual emissions according to the United States Energy Information Agency going forward. And these 2 lines here, the green and the red, are the capped emissions under the Waxman-Markey bill or the Kerry-Boxer bill in the Senate. Okay? The key thing I want you to take away from this is to get to here is a very rapid and dramatic change in business as usual trajectory for greenhouse gas emissions. That's the key takeaway here. And the other key takeaway is all of these bills down here, and even this bill to a lesser extent, involve a cap and trade market. Nobody's talking seriously in Congress, at least nobody's put forward serious legislation calling for a carbon tax. So all the various legislative proposals that have legs are about cap and trade, or in the case of the Cantwell-Collins bill, what they'll call cap and dividend. Now, in the near term, let's be very clear. There is no large-scale, cost-effective technology that can reduce emissions at scale. Okay, there's no thing you can bolt on a power plant There's nothing you can do in the economy that's a simple piece of technology, like a scrubber for SO2, like SCR for NOx control. There's just no technology out there. Now, EPRI's been working on a variety of technologies that Skiles talked about inside in the last session. Things like advanced coal generation, things like carbon capture and storage, third generation nuclear plants, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. These are all incredible technologies that do have the potential to dramatically reduce emissions, but say post-2018. Okay, the narrow time frame is the time frame that's really, really hard, the near term. Okay, now in our view at EPRI, we've done modeling looking at how could you reduce emissions in the U.S. economy. Well, it turns out the electric sector is a very, very large component of emissions in the U.S. economy. About 33% of emissions U.S. come from the electric sector. And the electric sector really is the lowest hanging fruit to reduce emissions. Doesn't mean it's cheap. It just means it's cheaper than the other sectors. Cheaper than transportation, cheaper than other industrial processes, but definitely not cheap. And when we try to model this and we ask the question, how could you achieve the similar emission reductions trajectory as required in the Waxman-Markey bill or similar legislation, what we come up with is the near-term answer is fuel switching, real time. That is the real-time dispatch of natural gas plants instead of coal plants. And that only happens in the economy if carbon prices roughly are above $30 a ton CO2. And in many parts of the country, in this region in particular, that number is more like $50 a ton CO2. These are very, very high numbers. Politically in the US, anything north of 20 is pretty much considered not possible. Now, I'm not making a normative judgment myself. I'm just saying the way things have been stacking up in Washington, people talk about low as 10 to 20. North of 20 makes politicians very, very nervous in Washington. Okay, and there's only really three ways you're going to reduce this. One is you're going to have some kind of safety valve or price collar on the price of carbon. You're going to buy government fiat, say if carbon goes above 30, we're going to flood the market with credits. Or we're going to allow companies to basically pay a fee, a tax, instead of having an allowance. An alternative would be somehow massive greenhouse gas emission reductions in other sectors of the economy. If you really believe the modeling you saw this morning, which I have many, many issues with, there are many people who will tell you that energy efficiency is wildly cost-effective. You can get all these emission reductions. We don't see that. We've done a lot of work in that space. We're the pioneers of energy efficiency. Our building invented the term demand-side management. Now, while we see there's a lot of efficiency gains to be had, a lot of them are baked into that baseline already. And a lot of them are not negative cost. Once you get down to market discount rates and the actual removal of double counting and what we call the bounce back effect. If cars get greater miles to the gallon, people drive them further. If people use have less kilowatt hours in terms of lighting, they'll use their lights more. We know this. This is happening already in many other areas of the economy. So the idea that there are billions of tons of free offsets or free allowances just waiting out there is very, very tough for us to see in the real world. What we can see, though, is fuel switching. We've seen that in the European emissions trading scheme. And that, again, is going to handle somewhere north here of $20 a ton, $30 a ton. Now, there is one way out of this conundrum, and that's the abundance of offsets, greenhouse gas emission offsets, taken from outside the cap and brought inside the cap. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we get going. Let's talk about these offsets. What are they? What are the benefits of them, and what are the risks? I've got 4 pictures here that kind of are some kinds of examples of offsets around the world. There's a coal mine methane destruction facility. Today, when we mine coal around the world, in the US as well, we vent methane fugitively. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. If we captured that methane and burned it, we destroy that methane. In agriculture, we can do it at large scale on confined animal feeding operations, methane lagoons, basically. Throw a tarp over them, light a match. Another one here is wind farms, say in China, a very, very large source of clean development mechanism credits. Renewable energy and energy efficiency projects in the developing world, countries that do not have emission reduction targets, qualify or could qualify as offsets. They're the largest one of the largest sources of offsets today in the international carbon market. I do want to be clear, though. Renewable energy projects here in the United States and energy efficiency projects will not count as offsets. They'll be under the cap. Assuming the cap covers the electric sector, those activities are good things. They'll help the electric sector achieve their own emission reduction responsibility to comply with the law if and when it's passed. But they're not offsets. That does not mean that they're good or bad. It's just they're a different mechanism by which they get covered in the regulatory scheme. But in China, where they're unregulated, you can emit freely. Putting a wind project in and reducing the grid emissions can definitely generate emission reductions. The one in the upper right is work we've done here with Michigan State. These are some fields that are involved in our on-field trials of nitrous oxide emissions abatement through reduced fertilizer use that you heard Neville and others speak about earlier. And then down here you have probably the largest emission source on the planet other than energy production, deforestation of the world's tropical forests. Probably the largest opportunity on the globe for generating offsets and reducing emissions cheaply is stopping the deforestation and degradation of tropical rainforests, principally in 2 countries, maybe 3. Brazil, Indonesia, and the Congo Basin. Those are the 3 places in the world where you really need to attack this. Now, what are offsets? Let's be clear about them. They're credits for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, avoidance, or sequestration, any of those 3 activities. But the really important part is that occur in sectors or geographic regions outside of the regulatory emissions cap. So for example, in the Waxman-Markey bill, they envision a cap that covers virtually 85% of the US economy. That is industrial sources, transportation, electric power generation, oil and gas operations, all would be covered by a cap that those entities operating within that cap would have to comply with the emission reduction requirements in there. The sectors that are outside the cap that would be sources for offsets, ag and forestry. That's pretty much it. Now, how do these offsets work? Neville alluded to this in his talk previously with the nitrous oxide emissions. Let me make a simpler example. Say this is a landfill that emits methane fugitively. And it would emit that methane over time, and that amount would come down over time as the landfill anaerobically digested the source of those emissions. You could put a collection device on that landfill. You could light a match. And you could burn that methane and convert it to CO2, changing its global warming potential from 21 to 1. You don't have to generate power with it, you just need to convert it to CO2 and water. And you've reduced the methane emissions quite a bit. If you do that, you drop emissions from here to here. That difference, that credit, that's the offset. But there's a lot of challenges in this picture. For example, you have to know what this baseline is. Well, once you've done a project, you can never know the baseline. There's a counterfactual there. You can't measure it out into the future if you've already implemented the project. And if you haven't implemented the projects, well, then you don't have a project. So we have to come up with a way to do these baselines that's based partially on empirical information and partially on modeling. And therein lies the rub. So in the trade, we say offsets are emission reductions that must be real. They actually have to happen. Okay? They have to be additional. That means they have to come about because of the existence of the carbon market. They weren't business as usual. You didn't do them for some other reason. You did them because there's a carbon market. You did them because there's a carbon regulatory regime that allowed you to capture the rent associated with offsets. They have to be permanent. They're not coming back. Or we have to make an approach in the regulatory world for dealing with them when they do come back. I'll talk about that in a minute. They have to be measurable. We have to be able to count them, and they have to be verifiable. Somebody has to be able to go out there and audit them and see that the emission reductions you claimed actually took place. So let's talk about some forestry and agricultural ones. Afforestation and reforestation are 2 of the biggest talked about. Afforestation is growing trees where they didn't grow at some date certain. Under the Kyoto Protocol, that's January 1st, 1990. If they grew on a site before that, it's reforestation. If they didn't, then it's afforestation, also known as A&R. Now, if you think about this, in one sense, this is a good one. You can grow trees on marginal agricultural land or land that's really even not suitable for agriculture, and you can store carbon in trees. Now, we got to talk scale, though. Okay, I have a good example of this. 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant, which would be a standard baseload coal-fired power plant, emits about 7 million tons of CO2 a year. If you grow trees on pretty decent land, not decent enough to make it commercial timber, but pretty high quality, so it grows pretty fast and sequesters carbon, and you assume it sequesters, say, 350 tons over 100 years, 3.5 tons per acre per year. Well, guess what? You need 2 million acres of land. That was 2 million acres of land to offset the emissions of 1 coal-fired power plant. And we have hundreds of them. So it's not really scalable. Okay? Red, we talked about. Emissions from deforestation is about, depends who you talk to, somewhere in the neighborhood, according to the IPCC, about 12 to 18% of global emissions. So this is a big dog. You can go after this one and you can really make a dent in climate change. Soil, carbon, and agriculture. I won't talk much about that in this audience. You guys know a lot about that topic. Other than to mention, I'm really pleased that we've had an opportunity to talk about this avoided nitrous work that MSU has pioneered and we've been delighted to fund. 8 of our companies within the EPRI membership have funded phase 1 of that work, which was the scientific work, and we're about to move forward with phase 2 again with MSU, where we're taking the protocol that Neville and Phil and others put together, and we're going to take it through the standard setting organizations, such that farmers actually could generate actual offsets doing this. Methane destruction, we mentioned, another one that's possible in ag. There are 3 other kinds of methane destruction, but in the Waxman-Markey bill, they essentially took them out of offsets and said we're going to regulate them directly. Coal mine methane, fugitives from the natural gas transmission and distribution system, that is methane that just leaks out of the pipelines. I forgot what the third one was. But in any case, those are out in the current bill, but they could very well be back in. Senator Stabenow from this state has been proposing what she calls her offsets amendment that has a whole slew of agricultural offset project types included in it. And many parties believe that if and when the Kerry Graham-Lieberman bill goes forward, it'll have the Stabenow amendment inside it as its offsets provision. The agriculture and forestry sectors are expected to be by far the largest sectors within the United States as sources of offsets. Now let's talk about the benefits of offsets. Why do it? So this is Congressional Budget Office estimates. They estimate in 2030, in the year 2030, the program that's outlined in the Waxman-Markey bill would cost the country $250 billion that year. 250, that's with a B, billion dollars, if you didn't allow offsets, or even if you did, if for some reason they didn't come to market. But if the amount of offsets, which are enormous in the Waxman-Markey bill, 2 billion tons per year are allowed, if those actually materialized, came to market, and were used, they estimate the cost to the economy to be more like $100 billion. So that's like a third, maybe 40%, right? And the CO2 price they estimate in 2030 would be $40 a ton with offsets, and without them, $140 a ton. So a dramatic world difference between a world with offsets at large scale and without. Now, they say the cost savings to the economy generated by offsets could be substantial. Annual savings from offsets could be about 70% under the bill as written. So if they come, they dramatically reduce the cost both to our members, the electric sector, and the emitters in the electric sector, but more importantly, to this society as a whole. Essentially what we're doing is we're allowing the substitution of lower cost abatement, whether domestic forestry and ag abatement or abatement in China, India, Brazil, and Mexico, to be used in place of higher cost abatement that could be done in the U.S. electric and industrial sectors. Now, offsets are not a panacea. They have technical challenges, and I want to be very blunt about that. We're very aware of the technical challenges, and have done quite a bit of work at EPRI and with our colleagues in many of the stakeholder groups to try to think this through. First off, additionality. You have to basically show an offset project really is new and different. It wasn't required by law, regulation, it's not common practice. It really came about because of the carbon market. And that's a very tough thing to do. That's really a policy call on which things are additional and which aren't. Or even the tests that get designed are a policy call. What are these tests and how do they work? You can't prove this one. Baselines we talked about, you can't prove them either. You have to make an agreement. A standard has to be set. Somebody has to decide what is that baseline. Neville talked about how in the nitrous oxide world it could be 5 years of a farmer's nitrogen fertilizer records. Is that good enough? Which standard will that be good enough for? Are there other ways it could be done? There are endless fights about these two. Now in ag and forestry there are two that are really unique, that are really important. Leakage and permanence. This is a picture of impermanence. You store carbon in trees can die. Disease can get them or fire can get them. In that case, CO2 is rapidly emitted back into the environment. Well, if you already issued carbon offsets for these trees, and they've already been used by Detroit Edison for compliance with a cap and trade, and then the forest burns up, who's liable for that increase in CO2 emissions? So the standards and protocols that are being developed around the country have ways of dealing with permanence. Leakage is another one. There was some talk this morning about leakage. That's that thing we heard in the plenary, indirect land use change. My colleague Steve Rose, who's an expert modeler, was at EPA and is now at EPRI, does a lot of work looking at the impacts of afforestation policies in the north and how they affect deforestation in the south. Suffice it to say, if we had a policy in the U.S. where we allowed afforestation to generate carbon credits, but not comprehensive forest policy, just afforestation, basically all that carbon abatement is blown out by increased deforestation in Brazil. And the reason for that is we take land out of production in the U.S. to grow trees, and they burn trees to put land into production. And the modeling is very tight on those relationships. I think Ruben may talk more about that. There's some other issues, measurement, monitoring, and verification, and some parties don't like the idea that offsets reduce the carbon price. Their worldview is different. They say, wait a minute, we need these advanced new technologies. So the higher the carbon price out of the box, the better. The higher the price, the more advantage there is to new technology and entrepreneurship, and so let's have at it right away. Now certainly, those who are concerned about the cost of policy, the cost of power users, the cost to the economy of a whole, that's not their view. So these challenges, I think, from our perspective, all of them can be addressed. But there is definitely an inherent challenge that can't. There is a challenge between the perfect environmental integrity, that every offset is 100% perfect, and the desire to scale up and get these things on the ground very, very rapidly. That's not going away. Now hopefully we can have large scale and do it cost effectively and have very, very high quality offsets, but it's virtually impossible to guarantee it 100% of the time. And I think those parties who study this or are involved in it, they recognize that. Let's talk briefly about the bill. This is the only bill that has passed